The European Union has agreed new sanctions against Israeli settlers. The bloc points to a surge in violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank since the start of the war in Gaza. Israel has denounced the measures, calling the sanctions arbitrary and political.
In Brussels, EU foreign ministers approved new sanctions to blacklist individual Israeli settlers and organizations. The measures had been blocked for months by the former Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, but the new government in Budapest has now lifted the veto.
Today, we reached a political agreement to sanction Israeli extremist settlers and entities. This goes together with new sanctions on leading Hamas figures. This means that we move from the political deadlock that was there for a long time. Violence and extremism carry consequences.
The new sanctions reflect rising violence against Palestinians as Israeli settlements expand in the occupied West Bank. The EU says there has been a surge in violence by settlers since the Gaza war began in October 2023. Israel's foreign minister, however, has condemned the EU's decision.
The European Union has chosen, in an arbitrary and political manner, to impose sanctions on Israeli citizens and entities because of their political views and without any basis.
Despite the agreement, EU nations remain divided over whether to go further, with some pushing for broader economic measures against Israeli settlements.
Our Brussels correspondent Rosie Burchard is on the story. Rosie, tell us more about these sanctions. What's the idea behind them?
The idea is to have some sort of punitive measure in response to what the EU says is a surge in violence against Palestinians. Now, this is a measure which had been on EU ministers' table for months. It had been long stalled, and I think most here think it was also really long overdue. Once we saw that new Hungarian government sworn in over the weekend, that appeared to be the thing which shifted the dial, lifted that veto, and meant that this measure could move forward. But Nicole, make no mistake, this is seen as an absolute lowest common denominator. There are all sorts of other ideas which have been knocking around EU ministers' table for months and even years at this stage over tougher punitive measures against not only violent settlers but against, in fact, the Israeli government. And those, for now, still really remain stalled and don't seem to be moving anywhere fast due to the bitter divisions between EU members on this topic of ties with Israel, which is one of those which causes such deep disagreement between these countries.
Let's zoom in on Germany, because Berlin has a strong but diplomatically sensitive relationship with Israel. Is Germany fully backing these sanctions?
Yes, Germany is fully backing these sanctions against violent settlers and groups that are seen as supporting them. But beyond that, Germany is not in favour of any tougher EU-level action against the Israeli government, which has been proposed so far. So we saw in the past Germany blocking a proposed measure to downgrade trade ties with Israel. Instead, Berlin has been urging for dialogue with Israel. And I should say that that has been frustrating some other EU countries. It really struck me today to hear Luxembourg's foreign minister making what I think was a really veiled or thinly veiled allusion to Germany when he said some countries are using their history in a way which he says is preventing any EU action. He says that has rendered him speechless. So there is some criticism of Berlin on that front, although that's criticism, of course, that Germany pushes back strongly against. It says it really does advocate strongly for a two-state solution and does try to hold the Israeli government accountable.
Some in the EU have proposed trade sanctions on Israel as well. Can we expect movement on that front now?
OK, so on this proposal which we had last year, which was to downgrade trade ties entirely, that seems to me to be moving nowhere. And that really is because Germany and some other EU countries, including Italy, are blocking it. They don't want it to move. Where we may see some movement over the next couple of weeks, maybe months, is a proposal that's come from France and Sweden to restrict or ban trade with illegal Israeli settlements, so to restrict the import of goods into the EU from those those settlements. That is something which the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief says she's talking to her trade colleague about to try and get some sort of a proposal on the table there. And we've heard a call from some member states that have been very vocal about this, the likes of Spain, Ireland, saying we need to move forward on this. There is no actual proposal for them to consider just now, but we may see something coming to their table in the next couple of weeks for them to review. Although, of course, the precedent here is that they get these proposals for sanctions on their table, and that's kind of where they remain. They end up frozen due to this disunity, and that may be what happens with this proposal on restricting trade with illegal settlements as well.
All right, now that these sanctions have been approved, tell us what happens next. How will these measures actually be implemented?
So in the next couple of days, we're going to get published in the EU's official journal. So that's where these laws are actually published, the names of the people and organisations which are going to be blacklisted under this latest raft of sanctions. And those people and organisations will then be banned from travelling to the EU. Any assets they have in the EU will be frozen, and it will become illegal for any EU entities to do business with them. So they're designed really to pack a punch here. And what we've heard from human rights campaigners is that they want this to be a starting point rather than for the EU to say, OK, we've made this measure now and we're going to take our pedal off the gas. They want further measures to try and ensure some sort of accountability. Remember, the EU is Israel's biggest trading partner.
DW's Rosie Burchard there in Brussels. Thanks so much for your reporting, Rosie.
Well, let's get more from Israel now. Our correspondent Emily Gordine joins us from Jerusalem. Emily, tell us more about Israel's response to these sanctions.
Well, Israel rejected firmly this decision. Foreign Minister Gideon Saar, we saw it just in the report, said the EU imposed these sanctions in a, quote, arbitrary and political manner. He's basically rejecting the premise that these sanctioned settlers committed human rights abuses, and that reflects a sort of a wider response from Israeli officials who are treating this as a politically motivated action rather than something that is based on evidence on the ground. Now, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who was a co-founder of one of the organizations that has now been sanctioned and to which he still holds very close links, called in response to the annexation of quote, strategic areas in the occupied West Bank. We've not actually had a response from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, although he did hold a security meeting tonight, though that is likely going to have focused on the ongoing conflict with Iran rather than these EU measures.
Are these sanctions, Emily, likely to make any difference on the ground there in the West Bank?
I think it's unlikely. The sanctions target a small number of individuals and organizations, and they likely knew that this was coming. What matters is how protected they are on the ground. And as things stand, and this is something that human rights organizations have long criticized, is that these settlers who live on occupied Palestinian land in the West Bank, they act with complete impunity and, in fact, are in some cases aided and protected, in many cases, in fact, by the Israeli state. And that's been documented by human rights organizations, Israeli as well as international ones, for months and years. And if anything, really, I think what we're likely going to see, and we've seen this in the past when, for example, countries recognized a Palestinian state, Israel moved closer to annexing territory in the occupied West Bank, effectively making the situation even more difficult on the ground. Now, the question is, though, and I think that's where the bigger weight lies, is whether the EU will move to a larger package that could curb trade on goods from these illegal settlements. But at this point, from what we understand, there's no majority at the EU for this. But this would carry a lot of economic weight if the EU would go forward with this.
So how are these sanctions likely to impact Israel's relationship with the EU and its member states, including Germany?
Well, I think this certainly marks the deterioration, but these sanctions, again, they are targeted and limited to specific settlers and organizations. and critics certainly have described them as largely symbolic. They're not state level. There were countries at the EU level that also wanted to include Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, and Bezalel Smotrich, as well as finance minister, on this sanctions list for their radical rhetoric. That did not happen. And there is a bloc at the EU that includes Germany that is still very protective of Israel when it comes to these sanctions packages, vis-a-vis some of their EU member state colleagues, if you so want. Now, again, though, this step is, if you look at it from the wider perspective, the step is essentially, though, it could build momentum to a larger package, right? The EU is Israel's largest trading partner. So the EU carries weight. It is important for Israel. So if there is a possibility that this measure builds momentum, leads to, just as Rosie just said, there are lots of ideas on the table. If this could lead to sanctions that affect Israel's trade relations directly with the EU, I think that is when it could get really dangerous for the EU-Israel relationship. But again, we are still very far away from that.
Emily, thank you very much. That was DW's Emily Gordine in Jerusalem.